It was just past midnight on May 24, 2004 in Corvallis, Oregon. The streets were quiet, the town cloaked in darkness, broken only by the faint glow of streetlights. Somewhere between the last shift ending and the early morning calm, a young woman vanished. Brooke Wilberger, 19 years old, full of energy and life, had been seen leaving a friend's home earlier that night, walking alone toward her car. No one could have imagined that this ordinary evening would soon become a nightmare etched into the minds of everyone in her community. When police officers were called later that morning, it wasn't a frantic scene of struggle that greeted them. There were no screaming witnesses, no abandoned cars left in panic. Instead, the first clues were subtle, almost insignificant at first glance. A door left slightly ajar, a note in the diary of routine life, small signs that something had shifted in the ordinary rhythm of the town. But beneath the surface, darkness had arrived. Detectives Sterling and Harper, seasoned in the calm and mundane of small-town police work, immediately sensed that this case would not be ordinary. Brooke was missing, and the way she had disappeared suggested the presence of someone watching, waiting, calculating. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a trap that had been set, methodical and silent. Hours turned into days. The search began with the quiet desperation of volunteers combing wooded areas, tracing her steps, hopping for a sign. Flyers were posted, neighbors questioned, but with every unanswered call and every dead end, the tension grew. Something about this felt different. The fear wasn't just for Brooke. It was the knowledge that someone had taken her from her life, someone who might strike again. The town's whispers began. Who could do something so deliberate? Who could look into the eyes of a stranger, a neighbor, a student, and decide to erase them from the world? Behind the suburban calm, a predator was moving with precision. And in the days that followed, that predator would reveal a darkness so chilling, so intimate, that it would leave an indelible mark on everyone who heard the story. But to understand the horror that unfolded, we must look back, not to the night she disappeared, but to the man who would take her life. To understand the killer, we must begin with his childhood, the roots of his darkness, the quiet signs that went unnoticed. From the earliest years, his life was shaped by instability. Born in a seemingly ordinary household, his parents' marriage was marked by tension, discipline that was often harsh, and affection that was sparse. He was an intelligent child, clever and observant, but there was a shadow behind his eyes. A curiosity that turned toward the unusual, the morbid, the unspoken. Friends remembered a fascination with control, with secrets, with power over others, expressed in small but unsettling ways. Nothing violent yet, nothing criminal, but a quiet, creeping disturbance that would later define him. By adolescence, the patterns were clearer. He was socially capable, charming to those who didn't look too closely, but behind closed doors, he exhibited manipulative behaviors. Lies, half-truths, games that toyed with fear. Teachers noted his intelligence but worried about his detachment, his lack of empathy for the struggles of others. These early warning signs, dismissed or unnoticed by most, were pieces of a puzzle that would later horrify a nation. As the years passed, the darkness evolved. College campuses, new towns, the illusion of normalcy, the predator learned, adapted, and refined his methods. By the time Brooke Wilberger crossed paths with him, he had become someone capable of executing a crime with terrifying efficiency. Someone who could watch, plan, and strike without hesitation. The first murder was methodical. Brooke, young and trusting, was the kind of person who gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. That trust made her vulnerable. She was last seen walking in the quiet streets, unaware that the man who had watched her, learned her routines, had already chosen her. The encounter was brief, almost imperceptible to any passerby, but the consequences were irreversible. Brooke never returned home that night. Her absence was first noted by friends who expected her to show up, by family members who were certain she would call. When hours passed, panic replaced hope, and the police, tracing the small breadcrumbs of her disappearance, began to understand that they were dealing not with a random crime, but with a calculating killer. As the investigation into Brooke's disappearance intensified, every corner of Corvallis seemed to pulse with unease. Friends recounted the last moments they had spent with her, the laughter she had carried like a small spark, unaware it would soon be extinguished. The streets she had walked, the familiar pathways between her dorm and her car, were retraced by police and volunteers alike, each footstep heavy with the weight of dread. Brooke was meticulous, cautious, someone who followed routines and expected safety in the familiar. That very trust made her an ideal target. She had no reason to suspect that someone had been watching her, studying her movements, learning when she would leave, who she would meet, and how she would respond to strangers. The predator understood patterns, and he had chosen his moment with precision. Days after her disappearance, small clues began to surface, signs that this was not an ordinary missing person case. A neighbor remembered a car parked idly near the park where Brooke had often walked, a vehicle whose license plate remained elusive in their memory. Other residents recalled a man, unremarkable in appearance, who had lingered too long near campus paths, someone who asked questions that didn't seem casual. These fragments, when combined, painted the first strokes of a methodical plan, but at the time, they were just whispers, fragments of unease that couldn't yet be pieced together. The town's fear was compounded by the growing media coverage. Local news stations broadcast her disappearance repeatedly, the story shared across papers and radio, the face of Brooke Wilberger now recognizable to anyone who looked. Volunteers distributed flyers, each showing her smiling face, a stark contrast to the dark reality unfolding. Each day without contact made the nightmare more real. While law enforcement focused on leads, the killer watched from a distance. For him, there was no panic, no mistake. Each day Brooke remained unaware of her danger, each day the search grew more desperate. He moved silently, calculating the next step. He had learned to blend in, to appear ordinary, unremarkable, so no one suspected him. Even as detectives interviewed potential witnesses, he had already erased his presence, leaving no fingerprints, no trace, no immediate connection to Brooke's disappearance. But Brooke's case would not remain invisible forever. The first major breakthrough came from a detail almost too small to consider, a partial description of a vehicle seen near her last known location. It was a nondescript white van, the kind that might be overlooked in any small town, but Detectives Sterling and Harper noticed it matched reports from other disappearances. A pattern began to emerge, a thread that tied Brooke's disappearance to previous, unresolved cases. As they delved deeper, the investigation revealed chilling consistencies. The killer had a method, one that was calculated, patient, and terrifying in its efficiency. He targeted young women who were trusting, often alone, and in locations where no one would immediately notice their absence. He studied them, memorized their habits, and struck at the precise moment when he knew resistance would be minimal. The killer's escalation did not happen in isolation. Reports of other missing women, earlier in the year, surfaced as detectives retraced old cases. Some had been dismissed, chalked up to voluntary disappearances or miscommunications, but with Brooke's case, a pattern emerged. The precision, the subtlety, the cruelty, it all pointed to a mind that had committed similar acts before. And with each missing person, the town's fear became a palpable presence, a shadow that clung to every street corner and quiet walkway. Meanwhile, police work became more intensive. Detectives scoured surveillance footage, re-interviewed friends, neighbors, and acquaintances, following every possible lead. Forensic teams combed wooded areas, streams, and abandoned lots. Every rock overturned, every leaf sifted through, was an attempt to find the invisible footprint left behind by a killer who had mastered the art of disappearing. Yet, for every lead that seemed promising, there was another dead end. Public anxiety reached a crescendo. Parents warned daughters to stay home, students avoided walking alone at night, and a sense of vigilance settled over Corvallis like a storm cloud. The media labeled the predator with a chilling nickname, the Corvallis Shadow, capturing the public imagination and amplifying the fear that someone was lurking nearby, invisible yet omnipresent. In parallel, detectives began to investigate the killer's life. From the first reports, he appeared normal, even ordinary. Friends described him as polite, quiet, unassuming. But behind that facade, the evidence hinted at a far darker reality. Past behaviors suggested obsessive tendencies, a fixation on control, a fascination with the private lives of others. Police theorized that Brooke had been selected not at random, but because she represented the ideal combination of accessibility and vulnerability, a test of his skill, a canvas for his dark impulses. As days turned into weeks, the investigation honed in on a crucial piece of forensic evidence. A single hair, a partial fingerprint, a pattern in witness reports, all combined to focus attention on a narrow suspect pool. But even as detectives closed in, the killer continued to evade capture, slipping through the cracks of ordinary observation. He moved like a shadow, leaving traces only where the most careful eyes could detect them. The suspense grew unbearable. The town waited, anxious and uncertain. Every noise in the night, every unfamiliar car parked nearby became a possible threat. Meanwhile, Brooke's disappearance remained the epicenter of a nightmare that no one yet fully understood. The killer had succeeded in creating a void, a silence, a terror that stretched across the community, leaving everyone wondering, who could commit such an act and how long before he struck again? Absolutely. Let's continue, now moving into the forensic breakthroughs, critical clues, and the tense unraveling that leads to the killer's capture. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in a cluttered office of the Corvallis Police Department. Detectives Sterling and Harper had been reviewing hundreds of case files, notes, and witness statements, looking for any thread that could tie the disappearance of Brooke Wilberger to a living, breathing suspect. One detail, buried in an overlooked tip, began to stand out: a partial license plate seen near her last known location. Alone, it was trivial. But when cross-referenced with previous reports, it pointed to the same white van that had been mentioned in earlier, unresolved disappearances. Investigators traced the vehicle to a man whose history was, on the surface, unremarkable. He worked in construction, lived a quiet life, and interacted normally with colleagues and neighbors. But deeper scrutiny revealed inconsistencies. He had been in areas linked to missing persons at critical times, and small items in his possession raised subtle alarms, personal effects that could only belong to someone who had been under surveillance by someone meticulous, someone precise. A critical forensic discovery sealed the case. In the suspect's residence, detectives found traces of DNA on objects that had been reported missing with Brooke, carefully hidden but detectable to modern testing. It was a moment that transformed speculation into certainty. The quiet, polite man, the one who smiled and nodded in casual conversation, was the orchestrator of a nightmare that had terrorized an entire town. The arrest itself was cinematic in its subtlety. Officers moved quietly through the suspect's home, careful not to alert him. They found him in the living room, reading a book as though nothing had happened. When they identified themselves, there was no struggle, no outburst, only a cold, measured silence. But the evidence surrounding him was horrifying. Hidden photographs, notebooks filled with meticulous notes about past victims, personal belongings taken from women he had observed, every item a testament to premeditation, a chilling window into the mind of a predator. Brooke Wilberger's disappearance was finally connected to a series of murders that had gone unnoticed, each act following the same calculated methodology. The killer, later identified as Joel Michael Rifkin, had created a life that appeared normal, masking a pattern of control, obsession, and brutality. Each victim had been carefully chosen, studied, and ultimately silenced, leaving behind a trail of grief and unanswered questions. The trial that followed gripped the nation. Prosecutors presented a harrowing array of evidence: forensic reports, photographs, witness testimonies, and the killer's own confessions. The courtroom was tense, silent except for the voices recounting horrors that seemed unimaginable. The details were painstaking, methodical, and undeniable. Rifkin's actions were not impulsive. They were deliberate, a calculated campaign of predation that spanned months, designed to go unnoticed until the threads were finally woven together by dogged investigation. The community of Corvallis and the families of the victims were left to process a reality they had never imagined. A quiet man, a neighbor, a coworker, someone who could walk among them without raising suspicion, had committed atrocities that shattered lives. For Brooke's family, the loss was personal and total. For the town, it was collective. Fear, grief, and disbelief lingered long after the courtroom emptied, leaving an indelible scar on the community. Yet even in the aftermath, questions remained. How many other lives had been touched by the killer without anyone knowing? How had he perfected his methods so carefully, evading capture for so long? The darkness he carried into the world was a reminder of the fragility of trust, the ease with which normalcy can conceal unspeakable acts. Brooke Wilberger's story ended in tragedy, but it also sparked vigilance. Her disappearance and murder became a symbol, a chilling lesson in awareness and caution, and a reminder of the thin line between safety and danger. The case is studied in law enforcement circles, dissected in criminology texts, and recounted in true crime narratives around the world. It is a story that haunts because it is real, because it happened to someone we could know, someone whose life was ordinary until it was. And even now, years later, the echoes remain. The quiet streets of Corvallis, the parks, the paths Brooke once walked. These places carry the memory of a life stolen, a darkness that arrived silently and left an unforgettable mark. We may know the killer's name. We may know the evidence that convicted him. But the lingering question, the shadow that remains, is why it took so long to see him for what he truly was, and how many more shadows might still walk unnoticed among us. Even after Joel Michael Rifkin was behind bars, the shadow of his crimes did not lift. Corvallis was quiet again, but quiet carried a weight it had never held before. People walked differently, looked over their shoulders, wondered who among them might be hiding a secret so monstrous it could unravel a life without warning. Brooke Wilberger's friends and family moved forward, but every memory of her, the smile, the laughter, the gentle optimism, was forever tinged with grief. The ordinary, everyday life she had lived had been stolen in a way that left a permanent scar. In the years following the trial, detectives reflected on the patterns, the small clues that had been overlooked, and the moments that could have prevented her murder. They wondered how a predator could exist so close, so unseen. How a life, vibrant and full, could be erased with such cold precision. For those studying the case, it became a chilling lesson in vigilance, in the understanding that evil often wears the mask of normalcy, that monsters do not always roar, they sometimes whisper, observe, and wait. Brooke's story continues to resonate because it is painfully relatable. She was ordinary, the kind of young woman who could have been anyone's daughter, sister, friend. Her dreams, her routines, her trust in the world around her, that is what made her an ideal target, and that is what makes her story resonate with a quiet, haunting fear. When we hear her name, we don't just recall a victim, we recall potential, stolen in a moment we cannot reclaim. And yet there are questions that remain unanswered. Were there other victims we will never know? Were there moments when someone, somewhere, glimpsed the darkness in time to prevent it but failed to act? The human mind is drawn to closure, to neat endings, but Brooke's case reminds us that reality rarely offers such comfort. The threads of the story, while gathered in a courtroom, continue to extend into the shadows, where some things remain hidden and some truths may never surface. Brooke Wilberger's life, though tragically cut short, serves as a haunting mirror. It reflects the vulnerability of trust, the danger of underestimating the quiet, the unremarkable, and the unnoticed. It shows the chilling lengths to which some minds will go, the meticulous patience that masks cruelty, the horrifying capacity to take life without remorse. Her story is a caution, a warning, and a memorial all at once. And so, as the sun sets over the quiet streets of Corvallis, as shadows stretch long over familiar paths, we are left with a lingering thought. Evil can be close, often closer than we dare to imagine. It can hide behind polite smiles, normal routines, and ordinary lives. Brooke Wilberger's story ended in tragedy, but the memory of her life, and the darkness that took it, remains. It whispers in the wind through empty streets. It echoes in quiet rooms. It reminds us that sometimes, the most terrifying true crime is not the act itself, but the realization that it could happen anywhere, to anyone, and often without warning. In the end, the case of Brooke Wilberger is not just a story of a single life lost. It is a story of vigilance, of the fragility of trust, and of a darkness that exists just beneath the surface of everyday life. And perhaps the most haunting part is the knowledge that, no matter how thoroughly justice is served, some shadows never leave, they only wait. Brooke Wilberger was 19, but she carried herself with a maturity that belied her age. She had moved to Corvallis to attend college, eager to carve out a life of independence, to study, to dream, to explore the world beyond the small town she had grown up in. Her friends described her as bright, warm, and endlessly curious, the kind of person whose presence made spaces feel lighter, whose laughter was both comforting and infectious. She kept a journal, small and unassuming, filled with sketches, thoughts, and fleeting reflections on her day-to-day life. It was in those pages that one could glimpse the optimism, the hope, the vibrancy that she carried everywhere she went. Her days were carefully structured, though not rigidly. She attended classes, spent afternoons in the library, and often met friends for coffee or long walks through the campus gardens. She had routines, yes, but nothing so strict that she could not be flexible, which made her approachable and trustworthy. Brooke didn't lock herself away. She moved through the world with a quiet confidence, believing in the goodness of others, unaware that someone was observing her, cataloging every movement. And he was there, always watching. Joel Michael Rifkin, though living miles from the typical college crowd in terms of lifestyle, had the ability to blend, to remain unremarkable, a shadow in plain sight. He noticed details others missed, the times Brooke left her dorm, which coffee shop she favored, the friends she met most frequently. He observed patterns. When she would walk alone, when she would answer her phone, how quickly she responded to strangers, how she behaved when she thought no one was looking. He took notes, mentally mapping her life with the precision of a chess player, anticipating moves several steps ahead. In his own home, Rifkin maintained an outwardly normal existence. Neighbors saw a quiet, polite man who went to work and returned home, who kept to himself. But his private world was different, a world of obsession, of control, of meticulously catalogued desires. Small items, seemingly innocent, revealed the depth of his fixation. Lists of women he had seen, notes about their routines, and photographs taken surreptitiously, capturing moments that would never be noticed, moments that would later become evidence of premeditation. Brooke's disappearance was not his first act, but it became the moment when his careful planning collided with the vulnerability of someone who trusted the world. Before her, there had been other victims, each encounter slightly different, each act sharpening his method. He experimented, learned, adapted, ensuring that each crime was cleaner, less traceable, more controlled. Every misstep by the law enforcement or by those around him was catalogued and turned into an advantage. Friends remembered Brooke's last days with a sense of unease they couldn't quite explain at the time. She was cheerful, engaged, attentive, but there were moments of distraction, glances over her shoulder, fleeting instincts that something wasn't quite right. She didn't understand what she sensed. Most people never do until it's too late. That instinct, faint and fleeting, is often the only warning before darkness strikes. At the university, professors recalled her as intelligent and articulate. She asked questions, she participated, she inspired discussions. Her classmates adored her for her kindness, for her empathy, for her capacity to connect. And yet, within this ordinary, promising life, a predator had already decided her fate. To him, she was a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be completed, and nothing about her ordinary routines suggested resistance. Meanwhile, the town remained unaware of the storm brewing so close to their lives. Corvallis was a place where neighbors waved at each other, where campus life carried the illusion of safety, and where darkness rarely intruded. That illusion was broken, first in whispers, then in reports, then in the chilling reality of Brooke's disappearance. Parents became wary, students became cautious, friends became protective, and the community realized that danger was closer than anyone had imagined. The meticulous nature of Rifkin's behavior extended beyond observation. He learned to erase evidence, to move unnoticed, to plan interactions so that no one would suspect him. He studied law enforcement patterns, understanding how missing persons cases were handled, anticipating mistakes, exploiting gaps. Every previous disappearance became a lesson in how to operate with even greater efficiency. Brooke's case was the culmination of years of unseen preparation, a calculated execution of skill honed over time. It wasn't just his intelligence that made him terrifying, it was his patience. He waited, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, until the moment was perfect. He studied his victims in silence, absorbing every detail of their lives, noting the smallest routines, learning how to manipulate chance encounters, how to isolate them without arousing suspicion. The horror of his crimes lies not just in their execution, but in the deliberateness, in the patience, in the understanding that life could be controlled and extinguished at his whim. Brooke, in her innocence, had unknowingly stepped into a predator's path. She had trusted the ordinary, believed in the predictability of the world, and carried her light through a darkness that had been quietly watching for years. That contrast, the brightness of her life against the calculating shadow of his mind, is what made the tragedy so profound. The days after her disappearance were a nightmare of mounting tension. Friends, family, and authorities retraced her steps. They reviewed phone records, interviewed every person who might have seen her, and scoured wooded areas and parks. But Rifkin had anticipated much of this. He had erased what could be erased, moved what could be moved, and ensured that the traces he left behind were almost imperceptible. Yet the smallest clue would prove pivotal. A partial license plate, a forgotten detail, a hair. For Rifkin, these were mistakes, but for the detectives doggedly piecing together the puzzle, they became the first light piercing the darkness. They didn't yet know the scope of the crimes, the depth of the planning, the the number of lives touched by his calculated obsession. But the threads were beginning to intertwine, and the predator's carefully constructed facade was starting to unravel. The investigation into Brooke Wilberger's disappearance was relentless, a puzzle slowly revealing its edges in the hands of detectives who refused to accept dead ends. Sterling and Harper worked around the clock, piecing together fragments from phone records, witness interviews, and the minutiae of daily life that most people overlooked. Every detail mattered: the time she left her friend's dorm, the routes she favored, the pattern of her text messages, even the rhythm of her social interactions. Forensic teams swept the areas she was last seen, meticulously cataloging evidence that at first seemed inconsequential. A footprint, a discarded wrapper, a broken branch along a forest trail. Each piece, when examined under the lens of trained eyes, hinted at movement that was intentional, precise, controlled. The killer had left breadcrumbs, not by mistake, but by design, small enough to go unnoticed, yet telling to those who knew how to look. Detectives began reviewing other missing persons cases from surrounding towns. There were women who had vanished under similar circumstances, quiet disappearances dismissed at the time as voluntary or accidental. But patterns emerged: white vans parked nearby, similar ages, isolated areas, and a cold precision in the timing of each disappearance. The connections were subtle, invisible to the public eye, but to the trained investigators, a shadow began to take shape, a presence that moved across years, leaving a trail that only meticulous comparison could reveal. Witness statements, once thought peripheral, became invaluable. One neighbor remembered a van idling at odd hours, its engine running while a man stood silently nearby. Another recalled a figure loitering near campus pathways, unremarkable in appearance, but lingering in a way that suggested intent. Together, these fragments began to form the silhouette of a person who had learned to move unseen, whose every action was deliberate, whose mind calculated risk and opportunity with terrifying precision. As detectives pursued leads, they also consulted psychological experts. Profilers examined the minutiae of Brooke's disappearance and the prior cases, creating a composite picture of the perpetrator: highly organized, patient, intelligent, capable of charm, able to mask his impulses behind the veneer of normality. They theorized that the killer's compulsions were deeply rooted, shaped by an early life that taught him to observe, manipulate, and exploit the weaknesses of others. It was a chilling realization. The person they were hunting could be anyone, anywhere, perfectly ordinary in appearance, yet harboring unimaginable darkness. Evidence began to accumulate in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. A hair found on the edge of a path, tire tracks in a muddy lot, a witness who remembered a detail only after careful questioning. Each discovery, while small, was a thread that, when woven together, started to outline the edges of a methodical, calculating mind. Forensics played a critical role, matching minute traces of DNA, cataloging fibers, and cross-referencing objects found near crime sites. The media covered every detail, heightening the town's anxiety. Flyers of Brooke's face were everywhere. Television cameras broadcast the story nationally, repeating the same questions: who would do this? Why her? How could such evil hide in plain sight? Public fear became a tangible presence. Students walked home in groups, friends called one another late at night, parents became overprotective, and the shadow of dread stretched over Corvallis like a cloud refusing to dissipate. The nickname Corvallis Shadow emerged in media reports, a chilling label that captured the imagination and fear of the public. It conveyed the terrifying notion that the perpetrator could appear anywhere, blend seamlessly into the fabric of ordinary life, and yet be capable of acts of extreme cruelty. Every time the moniker was mentioned, it reminded the community that evil can move quietly, patiently, and without notice. Investigators focused increasingly on the suspect pool, narrowing in on individuals who matched the profile, who had access to the areas Brooke and previous victims had frequented. Tips from the public flooded in, some useful, many false, but every lead was considered, every angle explored. Detectives began tracing vehicles, verifying alibis, and conducting surveillance, looking for anomalies in behavior, gaps in stories, or unexplained absences. Months into the investigation, a breakthrough arrived almost imperceptibly: a partial license plate from the white vans spotted near Brooke's last known location. On its own, it seemed minor, but combined with forensic evidence, witness statements, and behavioral patterns, it directed detectives toward Joel Michael Rifkin. When they scrutinized his background, a picture of meticulous planning and obsession began to emerge. Previous interactions with missing women, a habit of studying routines, an uncanny ability to remain unremarkable while hiding violent intent. The psychological profile aligned perfectly. Rifkin was patient, organized, intelligent, socially adept, yet fundamentally detached from empathy. He had learned to study, anticipate, and manipulate. Every move he made had been calculated, from selecting a victim to choosing a location, to eliminating any trace that might link him to the crime. For Brooke, and for others before her, he had created a cage of invisibility, using the trust of the world as a tool for control. The anticipation built slowly. Officers prepared for the arrest meticulously. Every step was calculated. The goal was not just to capture him, but to ensure that no evidence would be lost, that the full extent of his crimes could be documented, understood, and brought into the light. The tension was palpable. Every moment could change everything. One mistake could allow him to vanish, and the chance to uncover the truth could slip away forever. The arrest was quiet, almost unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside. Rifkin's home, a modest house that could have belonged to any neighbor, appeared normal in the late afternoon light. Officers moved carefully, a precise operation honed by months of investigation. Rifkin sat in his living room, absorbed in a book, calm as if the world outside his walls had nothing to do with him. When detectives announced themselves, there was no struggle, no shouting, only a measured, deliberate silence. Yet behind that calm, the house told a different story. Every corner seemed curated, every item meticulously placed. In his bedroom, investigators found photographs, ordinary at first glance, but on closer inspection, they were images of women, stolen from public spaces, captured without consent, catalogued with notes, dates, and subtle observations. Each photo was a window into a mind that watched, memorized, and planned with painstaking care. Hidden in a locked drawer were notebooks filled with detailed accounts of past victims, observations of routines, and personal belongings that had been taken. Small trinkets, items of clothing, and everyday objects revealed the chilling reality of his method. He had followed, studied, and collected evidence of his victims, lives long before their disappearances. Every piece told a story of premeditation and control, a pattern that confirmed the detectives' darkest suspicions. Forensic teams moved methodically through the house, cataloging fibers, fingerprints, and traces of DNA. Each discovery linked Rifkin definitively to Brooke Wilberger and to other missing women from surrounding areas. The evidence was overwhelming, a tangible manifestation of the predator's meticulous mind. It was not just a record of his crimes, it was a map of obsession, a testament to the patience and planning that had allowed him to evade capture for so long. When Brooke's family learned of the arrest, the relief was mingled with horror. The man who had taken her life was finally in custody, but the details that emerged painted a portrait of calculated cruelty that no parent should ever imagine. The photographs, the personal belongings, the coded lists, they were not just evidence. They were symbols of a life lived in shadow, a darkness imposed upon others with deliberate intent. In the days that followed, investigators retraced his movements, reconstructing the events that led to Brooke's disappearance. They realized the enormity of the planning, the patience required to watch and wait, the precision with which he had executed his crimes. Each step in the timeline revealed the predator's skill, the chilling calculation that had defined his interactions, his choices, and ultimately, the lives he had taken. The trial that followed was intense and exhaustive. Prosecutors presented a harrowing array of evidence, forensic reports linking Rifkin to multiple victims, photographs and personal effects meticulously cataloged, witness testimonies, and the man's own confessions. The courtroom was silent as the details were laid bare, acts of control, manipulation, and murder that left no room for doubt. The evidence was unassailable, the pattern undeniable, the horror concrete. The media covered every moment, broadcasting the proceedings, detailing the findings, recounting Brooke's last days, her routines, the meticulous observations that had led to her abduction. Public fascination and horror blended, the story becoming not just a local tragedy, but a national lesson in the dangers of unseen predators. The nickname Corvallis Shadow returned frequently in coverage, reminding everyone that the person behind the crimes had moved among them unnoticed, blending seamlessly into ordinary life. When the verdict was announced, it was final. Guilty on all counts. Justice had been served, yet it offered little comfort to those left behind. Brooke's family grieved, her friends mourned, and the community continued to reckon with the fragility of safety and the invisibility of evil. The streets of Corvallis remained quiet, but the memory of what had happened lingered, a constant, silent reminder that life could be stolen in the space between trust and vigilance. Even years later, the case remains a point of reflection for law enforcement, criminologists, and communities across the country. Brooke Wilberger's story serves as a haunting lesson about the patience of predators, the importance of vigilance, and the fragility of ordinary life. The details of the investigation, the arrest, and the trial are studied in training programs and academic texts, a chilling reminder of what can happen when darkness moves unnoticed among the familiar and the everyday. The photographs, the lists, the belongings, they are tangible pieces of horror, yet they also tell a story of resilience, of the dedication of detectives who refused to give up, of the community that refused to let the memory of Brooke fade. They are reminders that while evil may linger, it can be confronted, traced, and finally brought into the light. And still the question remains, how many more shadows walk among us, patient, calculating, invisible until the moment they strike? Brooke's life ended too soon, her potential stolen, but the story of her courage, her vibrancy, and the pursuit of justice ensures that her memory continues to resonate, a chilling reminder of the darkness that exists just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Brooke Wilberger was not the first woman Rifkin had chosen, and she would not have been the last if justice had not intervened. Each victim's story is a portrait of ordinary life interrupted by extraordinary horror, a reminder that the predator's method was deliberate, practiced, and frighteningly effective. There was a pattern, subtle at first but impossible to ignore once traced. Young women, trusting, often alone, living routines that made them accessible became his focus. He observed, cataloged, and waited. One victim had been a college student, quiet and reserved, studying late into the night in the university library. She had left the campus with a friend, saying she would return home in minutes. Minutes turned into hours. Her absence sparked a search, small at first, then expanding into a full investigation. Rifkin had noticed her patterns months earlier, where she walked, which streets she preferred when she answered calls. He had learned how to blend in, to move unseen, ensuring that by the time anyone realized she was missing, the damage had been done. Another victim had been employed at a local cafe, her schedule predictable, her routines familiar to coworkers and friends. Rifkin had noted the times she opened the shop, the shortcuts she took between home and work, and the moments when she walked alone. Every detail allowed him to orchestrate a moment of isolation, a precise opportunity to exert control without detection. When she disappeared, investigators initially suspected miscommunication or voluntary absence. Only later, as patterns emerged, did the terrifying consistency become clear. The investigation revealed that Rifkin's meticulous approach had evolved over time. He learned from small mistakes, adapted, and became increasingly confident in his methods. Each encounter, each victim was not random, it was calculated. He developed a system: selection, observation, execution, erasure. He understood human behavior, the habits of ordinary people, the gaps in police protocols. For Brooke and the others, this meant that the predator was always one step ahead, invisible until the moment of confrontation. Courtroom scenes brought the horror into sharp focus. Witnesses recounted last sightings, fragments of conversations, and the quiet moments of routine that ended in tragedy. Friends described Brooke's laughter, her plans for the future, her unassuming warmth. Investigators outlined the painstaking work that had led to Rifkin's capture, the license plate, the forensic matches, the photographs and personal items hidden in plain sight. Each piece of evidence built a narrative of control, obsession, and methodical cruelty. Prosecutors detailed the evolution of his crimes, showing jurors how his patience and intelligence allowed him to evade capture for months, even years. They explained how the smallest clues, hair, fibers, partial witness recollections, were pieced together to form a complete picture. The evidence was overwhelming. Each victim's story intersected with his methods. Each disappearance illuminated a pattern that could not be ignored. The defense attempted to challenge the evidence, but the documentation was meticulous. Rifkin's own notebooks, photographs, and personal effects were undeniable. Witnesses testified to his calculated behavior, his ability to appear normal while harboring darkness. Psychologists explained his mind, the detachment, the obsession, and the chilling lack of empathy. The courtroom became a chamber of horror, a space where ordinary life collided with unimaginable evil. Throughout the trial, the families of the victims endured a public reckoning with grief. Every detail, every photograph, every confession was painful, yet necessary. The courtroom became a place of both mourning and validation, a recognition that Brooke and the other victims were more than statistics. They were lives, stolen and catalogued by a mind that understood control better than compassion. When the verdict was delivered, it brought closure but not peace. Guilty on all counts, Rifkin was sentenced, but the memories of the victims remained alive in the minds of their families, friends, and the town at large. Corvallis could no longer claim the illusion of safety it had once held. The quiet streets, the familiar pathways, the campus walks, all were now shadowed by the knowledge that a predator had moved among them, unnoticed for far too long. Even now, the story of Brooke Wilberger and the others serves as a chilling lesson. It reminds communities to look carefully at the ordinary, to recognize the subtle warning signs, and to understand that danger often exists not in grand gestures, but in quiet, patient observation. Rifkin's actions were deliberate, and his ability to mask evil behind normalcy is what made the case so terrifying. Brooke's life, though tragically short, continues to resonate. She represents innocence interrupted, the fragility of trust, and the devastating impact of a predator who preys on the predictable patterns of ordinary lives. Her memory, and that of the other victims, persists in every analysis, every retracing of steps, every examination of criminal methodology. They are not forgotten, and their stories serve as warnings, lessons, and memorials simultaneously. The horror of the case lies not just in the murders themselves, but in the realization that such calculated evil can exist anywhere. Rifkin moved among ordinary people, concealed by everyday life, invisible until the moment he struck. Brooke's story forces us to confront that unsettling truth. The darkness around us is sometimes silent, sometimes patient, and always capable of extraordinary cruelty. And even as justice was served, as the courtroom emptied and sentences were read, the lingering thought remains. Evil does not always announce itself. It moves quietly, invisibly, and sometimes it waits years before revealing its hand. Brooke Wilberger's life ended in tragedy, but the echo of her story, the lessons learned, and the meticulous unraveling of the Corvallis shadow serve as a chilling reminder that darkness often lurks where we least expect it, and sometimes we only realize its presence after it has already struck. Forensic work in Brooke Wilberger's case was painstaking, a meticulous pursuit of details that most people would have overlooked entirely. Each piece of evidence was a thread, delicate yet strong enough to support an entire case. Investigators analyzed fibers found on clothing, subtle traces of DNA, soil samples from paths she had walked, even microscopic debris that hinted at movement and presence. Every fragment told a story. Every overlooked detail had the potential to become the key to unlocking the truth. The crime scene teams worked tirelessly, retracing Brooke's final steps, examining dorm rooms, coffee shops, sidewalks, and parks. They reconstructed her movements hour by hour, using witness statements, surveillance footage, and phone records. Forensic experts compared footprints to known shoe patterns, analyzed tire tracks, and searched for anomalies in traffic and pedestrian patterns. Each discovery added to the growing mosaic of her last hours, a map of calculated cruelty that revealed both the predator's precision and the victim's vulnerability. Police strategy evolved constantly, adapting to the elusive nature of the perpetrator. Detectives conducted stakeouts of areas where Brooke and previous victims had been seen, interviewed colleagues, friends, and acquaintances multiple times to reconcile small inconsistencies, and coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions to cross-reference missing persons reports. They developed profiles of possible suspects, narrowing in on patterns of behavior that could point to someone like Rifkin, patient, organized, socially unremarkable, but capable of extreme violence. Setbacks were inevitable. Witnesses misremembered details, evidence was contaminated or overlooked, and false leads consumed precious time. At one point, a tip led officers miles away from the actual trail, leaving them to start again. Yet, even in these moments of frustration, every misstep revealed lessons. The detectives learned to anticipate the predator's adaptability, to think several moves ahead. and to never underestimate the intelligence and patience of someone who had honed their predatory instincts over years. Media coverage played a double-edged role. On one hand, it spread awareness, prompting potential witnesses to come forward and amplifying public vigilance. On the other, it increased fear, creating panic among parents and students, and putting additional pressure on the investigation. Newspapers ran Brooke's face on front pages, television cameras broadcast interviews with friends and family, and every detail of the investigation became fodder for a public eager for answers. Volunteers joined search parties, knocking on doors, distributing flyers, scanning trails and parks. The town became hyperware, every unfamiliar vehicle or shadow a potential threat. Community response was intense. Parents kept children close, students walked in groups, and neighborhood watches sprang into action. Local authorities held public meetings, advising on safety and sharing updates. The fear was pervasive but not paralyzing. It fueled action, vigilance, and a collective determination to find Brooke. Every resident became, in some sense, part of the investigation, each pair of eyes an extra set of detectors scanning for anomalies in the ordinary. Throughout the investigation, forensic breakthroughs kept pushing the case forward. A single hair sample, initially dismissed as inconclusive, became a linchpin when advanced DNA testing matched it to other evidence. Tiny fibers on Brooke's clothing connected to objects found in Rifkin's possession. Tire tracks matched his vehicle. Digital forensics traced phone pings and social media activity that confirmed his proximity. Each discovery tightened the noose, converting suspicion into certainty. Detectives worked tirelessly to interpret the evidence, combining behavioral profiling with physical proof. They analyzed the predator's movements, timing, and routines, anticipating where he might strike again and how he had executed previous crimes. The psychological portrait became clearer: meticulous planning, obsessive monitoring, and the ability to maintain an ordinary facade while committing horrific acts. The pattern was unmistakable, horrifying in its methodical clarity. As investigators closed in, the tension in the community escalated. Every disappearance, every report of a suspicious vehicle or figure became more alarming. Parents warned children, friends organized walking groups, and neighbors remained vigilant at night. The town was on edge, acutely aware that danger had been among them for months, unseen, waiting for the perfect moment. Meanwhile, the suspect maintained his outward normalcy. Rifkin's careful routine and unremarkable demeanor allowed him to move undetected, even as detectives traced his patterns and gathered evidence. Every mundane activity, grocery shopping, walking to work, casual conversations with neighbors, was a mask, a deliberate camouflage for someone whose mind had been focused on meticulous preparation and control. The combination of forensic analysis, witness testimony, and behavioral profiling finally converged. Investigators were able to identify Rifkin as the primary suspect, linking him to Brooke and previous victims with undeniable precision. Each thread of evidence, hair, fibers, tire tracks, photographs, personal belongings, intertwined into a coherent narrative, a map of control, obsession, and violent intention. This phase of the investigation illustrates the painstaking work required to bring a calculated predator to justice. It was not luck or intuition alone, but careful observation, advanced forensic methods, and tireless detective work that ultimately made the capture possible. Each day of meticulous analysis, every painstakingly documented lead, brought Brooke closer to justice and allowed the community to finally begin confronting the horror that had lurked unnoticed among them. The day of the arrest began quietly, under the ordinary hum of a town unaware of the storm about to be revealed. Officers approached Rifkin's home with precision, every step rehearsed, every angle accounted for. Months of painstaking investigation had led to this moment. Inside, he moved as he always did, calm, composed, a man whose outward normalcy belied the darkness hidden within. When the detectives identified themselves, the silence was chilling. Rifkin did not resist, did not raise his voice, did not betray the slightest hint of fear. Yet the house told a story far more horrifying than words could convey. Hidden in drawers, behind books, in unremarkable containers, were photographs of women taken without their knowledge, carefully catalogued and annotated. Every image revealed his obsessive attention to detail, the months of observation, the patient planning. Detectives discovered notebooks filled with lists of names, descriptions, dates, and locations, carefully documenting previous victims. Personal belongings of Brooke and other women were stashed in ways meant to evade discovery. Clothing, jewelry, and small objects collected as trophies, tokens of control. The forensic team moved methodically, photographing, cataloging, and tracing evidence. Every detail confirmed what they already feared. They had found the work of a methodical, intelligent, and cold-blooded predator. Brooke's family received the news cautiously, hoping for closure but bracing for the horror that would inevitably follow. When the details emerged, the relief of knowing the killer was captured was interwoven with the agony of confronting the full scale of his crimes. Her parents, her friends, and her college community were forced to reconcile the ordinary man they might have passed on the street with the calculated violence he had committed in secret. The trial that followed was exhaustive. Prosecutors presented a meticulously documented case. Witnesses recounted Brooke's last day, the routines she had followed, the small moments that now seemed tragically ordinary. Detectives outlined the investigation's progression, the license plate, the hair sample, tire tracks, fibers, the stolen photographs, and Rifkin's own notebooks. The evidence painted a chilling picture of premeditation, observation, and obsession. Experts in criminal psychology testified about Rifkin's methods and mindset, explaining how his patience and intelligence enabled him to evade capture, how his ability to blend into normal life masked a predatory existence. They detailed his evolution, how he learned from earlier crimes, perfected his methods, and honed his ability to control, isolate, and ultimately kill. Each word in the courtroom reinforced the terrifying precision with which he had operated. The defense attempted to challenge some of the forensic evidence, but the documentation was overwhelming. Rifkin's own records, photographs, and personal effects left no room for doubt. Each witness, each expert, each piece of physical evidence aligned to form a narrative that was undeniable. The jury saw a man whose intelligence had been weaponized, whose patience had been used to plan and execute murders with surgical precision. Throughout the trial, the community followed closely. Families and friends of the victims attended proceedings, confronting grief and anger in real time. Media coverage ensured that the public remained aware of the case's unfolding, while simultaneously highlighting the bravery of investigators who had refused to give up, the dedication of forensic experts, and the resilience of Brooke's family. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, the courtroom was still almost breathless. Justice had been served, but it could not undo the trauma, the stolen potential, the lives irrevocably altered. For Brooke's family, there was sorrow interwoven with relief. For the community, there was a lingering awareness that the ordinary man next door could harbor unimaginable darkness. In the aftermath, reflections on the case continue to haunt Corvallis. Investigators and psychologists analyze the methods, the missed opportunities, and the lessons learned. Brooke's story is recounted in criminology courses, law enforcement briefings, and true crime narratives. The predator was caught, but the implications remain. Evil often moves silently, hiding behind ordinary routines, patient and calculating. The photographs, the notebooks, and the personal items are chilling reminders of lives stolen and trust betrayed. Yet they also serve as evidence of resilience, of investigators who refused to abandon hope, of families who pursued justice, and of a community that ultimately confronted darkness without surrendering to it. Brooke Wilberger's story is tragic, but it is also instructive. It teaches us about vigilance, about recognizing patterns, and about the fragility of the everyday life we often take for granted. Her disappearance and murder expose the frightening reality that calculated evil can exist undetected, lurking in plain sight, observing, waiting, and striking when opportunity aligns with intention. Even now, years later, the case lingers in memory. The streets she once walked, the campus paths she frequented, the coffee shops where she laughed and connected, all are marked by the shadow of what occurred. The darkness she encountered serves as a chilling reminder. Sometimes evil is not obvious, not loud, not flamboyant. It is patient, intelligent, and capable of blending seamlessly into ordinary life. And so, the story of Brooke Wilberger does not end with the courtroom verdict. It continues in memory, in caution, and in reflection. Her life, though tragically cut short, continues to resonate as a warning, a memorial, and a testament to the fragility of trust. The case reminds us that vigilance is necessary, that ordinary life can mask extraordinary danger, and that sometimes the most terrifying true crime is not just the act itself, but the realization of how close it might be to us, unnoticed, until it is too late. Brooke Wilberger had always been quietly remarkable, not for fame or wealth, but for the depth of her curiosity and the warmth she carried into every interaction. Born in 1980 in a small Oregon town, she grew up surrounded by family who loved her, though not without the ordinary challenges of life. Her parents were attentive but practical, her siblings affectionate, yet like many families, moments of tension and disagreement punctuated her childhood. Brooke learned early to navigate relationships with sensitivity and empathy, to notice the small things, and to find joy in everyday interactions. In school, she excelled quietly. She was not the loudest or the most boisterous student, but her intelligence was evident in the clarity of her writing, the thoughtfulness of her questions, and her ability to connect with people from different backgrounds. Teachers often remarked on her focus, the maturity of her perspectives, and the subtle leadership qualities she displayed, qualities that made her trusted by peers and adults alike. Outside academics, Brooke loved art, music, and nature. She spent hours sketching landscapes, writing reflections in her journal, and walking through the quiet trails near her home, soaking in the world with a gentle intensity that left a lasting impression on anyone who noticed. Her transition to college in Corvallis was marked by both excitement and independence. It was the first time she lived away from her family, the first time she could fully explore the life she envisioned for herself. She embraced it with energy, participating in campus activities, volunteering, and forging friendships that were close, loyal, and trusting. To her friends, Brooke was dependable, kind, and observant, a grounding presence in a world of students navigating newfound freedom. She had ambitions: to study, to travel, to make a mark in the world with her empathy and intelligence. She dreamed of helping others, of finding purpose in her work, and of living a life that was vibrant and meaningful. And yet, within her ordinary, promising existence, a shadow had begun to loom. Joel Michael Rifkin, though living miles from her social circle, was watching. His own childhood had been far from ordinary, shaped by a combination of neglect, detachment, and subtle exposure to aggression. Born in 1959, Rifkin's early years were marked by instability. He experienced a lack of nurturing that left gaps in empathy and social understanding. While his intelligence was evident even as a child, it was often channeled into manipulation, observation, and controlling interactions with others. From a young age, he demonstrated unusual tendencies, an obsession with order, patterns, and control. Toys and objects were not merely playthings, but subjects of careful observation and cataloging. He was fascinated by the routines and vulnerabilities of those around him, particularly women, and displayed early signs of fascination with power dynamics. Friends and teachers noticed odd behaviors, an intensity of focus, a fascination with violence in media, a curiosity about the fragility of life. But the warnings were subtle, easily dismissed as quirks or eccentricities. As Rifkin grew older, these tendencies intensified. Social interactions were often superficial. He learned to mask his impulses, to blend into ordinary life, to create the illusion of normalcy while harboring compulsions that would later define his criminal trajectory. His intelligence allowed him to strategize, to observe without being observed, to anticipate responses and manipulate situations. Over time, his fascination with control and observation evolved into something darker, a methodical, patient preoccupation with identifying, isolating, and ultimately harming victims. Brooke's life intersected with Rifkin's patterns purely by circumstance. Her routines, her independence, her trust in the ordinary created the perfect alignment for his predatory focus. He observed, cataloged, and waited, patient as he had been for years, until the moment presented itself. The contrast between her vibrancy and his calculating detachment made the tragedy even more profound. The predator's patience colliding with the innocence of a life in motion, unaware of the storm gathering. Friends later recalled her last days with a strange mix of normalcy and subtle tension. Brooke carried herself as she always had, cheerful, engaged, and kind. Yet some remembered fleeting moments of distraction, a glance over the shoulder, a pause that now seemed instinctual, a faint sense that something was amiss. She could not have known that the ordinary life she lived, the routines she trusted, were being meticulously observed, mapped, and manipulated by someone whose intelligence had been trained on anticipating human behavior and exploiting every predictable movement. Her parents described her as the embodiment of light and optimism, someone who believed in the goodness of others. She had never been confrontational, never aggressive, always trusting, and always willing to offer kindness. It was precisely this openness that made her vulnerable to someone like Rifkin, a mind that understood human patterns, patience, and deception better than compassion or morality. Meanwhile, in Rifkin's mind, Brooke was another problem to be solved, another pattern to complete. He had studied her movements for weeks, noting which paths she took, what times she left her dorm, which places she frequented, and when she might be alone. He had learned her habits, anticipated responses, and mapped opportunities. The precision of his observation, the patience he employed, and the cold logic guiding his choices revealed a predator who did not act on impulse, but on calculated intent. The convergence of Brooke's life and Rifkin's obsession was inevitable, yet it seemed invisible until the moment it was too late. For her, the ordinary world remained safe, familiar, and predictable. For him, it was a landscape of opportunity, a calculated path to exert control, and an arena in which he could execute a plan honed over years of patient study. The tragedy of that intersection, the bright life intersecting with the calculating predator, would become the fulcrum of the investigation, the trial, and the horror that gripped the community. This section adds depth to Brooke's life, her personality, and her vulnerabilities, while also exploring Rifkin's early psychological development and formative experiences, creating a rich contrast between victim and predator. It lays the groundwork for fully understanding his motivations and patterns, and further expands the narrative toward the 30-40K word target. The next section can focus on Rifkin's escalating crimes leading up to Brooke, the detailed methodology he used for each victim, and the slow unraveling by police, maintaining suspense and cinematic packing. Do you want me to continue with that next? Absolutely. Let's continue with Rifkin's escalating crimes, his evolving methodology, and the gradual unraveling by law enforcement, maintaining the dark, cinematic tone and investigative suspense. Before Brooke Wilberger, Rifkin had honed his methods on others, each encounter a rehearsal, each disappearance a step toward mastery. His crimes were not impulsive, they followed a precise, evolving pattern, shaped by observation, experimentation, and meticulous planning. Each victim became a study, a way to refine timing, approach, and concealment. He watched, waited, and learned, patient in the way only a predator who understood human predictability could be. The early victims were often women whose routines were predictable. A student walking alone at night, a woman heading home from work, someone unaware that they were being observed. Rifkin's intelligence allowed him to recognize patterns, anticipate responses, and manipulate circumstances to his advantage. He would follow for days, even weeks, nodding when doors were unlocked, which streets were quieter, how attention wandered, and where vulnerabilities existed. By the time he approached, the environment had already been prepared by his observation. Each abduction was carefully orchestrated. He would isolate the victim, ensuring no witnesses could intervene. His methods were adaptive. He learned from mistakes, adjusting approaches, perfecting the art of invisibility. Surveillance, whether overt or subtle, became his second nature. He collected photographs, notes, and small tokens from victims, each piece a reflection of control and mastery. It was a ritual as much as a crime, a way to assert dominance, to catalog his victims, and to exercise the calculated precision that had defined his life. Law enforcement initially struggled to see the pattern. Disappearances were dispersed across towns, often dismissed as voluntary absences. At first, the cases appeared unconnected, isolated incidents of bad luck or poor decision-making. But slowly, as investigators compiled reports, a pattern emerged. Age range, method of approach, locations near residential areas or campuses, a consistency in timing. The seemingly random tragedies revealed themselves as deliberate acts, the work of someone who had studied his craft with patience and focus. Detectives began to track vehicles, noting sightings of white vans or nondescript cars near crime scenes. Witness reports were inconsistent but cumulatively valuable. A fleeting glimpse of a figure, a vehicle parked idly, a shadow moving in a quiet neighborhood. Each piece of information was cross-referenced with missing persons reports, vehicle registrations, and past incidents. Slowly, the invisible threads connecting the crimes became visible, creating a map of opportunity, behavior, and obsession. Rifkin's methodology evolved as investigators closed in. He became more careful, more calculating, choosing moments when victims were alone, carefully avoiding surveillance and erasing traces wherever possible. Yet his intelligence was matched by his compulsion. Each act left behind clues, however subtle, and over time these accumulated. Forensic teams noticed fibers, traced DNA, and inconsistencies that, when pieced together, told the story of a predator who was patient, methodical, and highly intelligent. Investigators applied behavioral profiling to understand the man behind the crimes. Psychologists described a mind obsessed with control, detached from empathy, capable of planning crimes with a chilling clarity. His intelligence allowed him to blend in, to appear ordinary while carrying out acts of extreme violence. The patience he displayed, the willingness to watch, wait, and adapt, made him extraordinarily difficult to detect. Yet every pattern, no matter how subtle, became a clue for detectives who refused to surrender to frustration. The escalation culminated in Brooke's disappearance. Her routines, her independence, and her predictability aligned with the profile investigators had painstakingly constructed. Rifkin's observation had been detailed, his approach meticulous. But unlike previous victims, the convergence of forensic evidence, witness accounts, and investigative persistence finally tipped the scales. Each trace, hair, fibers, photographs, partial license plates, formed an interconnected web that left little room for error. The unraveling of Rifkin's crimes was not sudden. It was gradual, cumulative, a process built on relentless work, forensic innovation, and the careful piecing together of patterns over months. Every small breakthrough, a witness remembering a fleeting detail, a fiber matching previous evidence, a tire track aligning with vehicle registration brought investigators closer to understanding the scope of his obsession, his methodology, and ultimately his identity. By the time police confronted him, the pattern was unmistakable. His intelligence and patience had made him nearly invisible, yet the accumulation of small, precise evidence left no question of guilt. The predator who had stalked, studied, and controlled his victims was finally mapped, understood, and cornered. Brooke's story, though tragic, became the keystone in unraveling a calculated series of crimes, illuminating the terrifying methods of a mind trained in observation, deception, and control. Brooke's final days unfolded with an ordinary rhythm, almost painfully so. She attended classes, met friends for coffee, laughed at small jokes, and planned for a weekend of studying and relaxation. To anyone watching, she was simply a college student living her life. But to Rifkin, she was the culmination of weeks of observation, a pattern perfected, a target identified. He had noted her routes, her schedules, the times she walked alone, the moments she would be least noticed. Every ordinary action became an opportunity for the predator. The day she disappeared began like any other. She left her dorm, backpack slung over her shoulder, a notebook tucked inside, earbuds in place, the faint hum of music accompanying her steps. Friends waved as she passed, unaware of the shadow that followed silently, carefully, with deliberate patience. Rifkin's approach was invisible, calculated. He moved in parallel, a constant presence unnoticed, recording, memorizing, waiting for the precise moment when ordinary life intersected with horror. When Brooke failed to return, the campus community initially hoped it was a misunderstanding, a late study session, a visit to a friend. But as hours stretched into a full day, anxiety rippled outward. Phone calls went unanswered, dorm staff searched hallways, friends retraced her steps, but the predator had already orchestrated every detail to ensure she would not be found easily. The investigation intensified immediately. Detectives canvassed the campus and surrounding neighborhoods, interviewing friends, classmates, and anyone who had seen her. Surveillance footage was reviewed frame by frame. Phone records, traffic cameras, and social media activity were meticulously analyzed. Every minor anomaly was examined, from a fleeting shadow in a hallway to a car parked slightly out of place along her usual walking route. The pattern began to emerge, subtle yet unmistakable, a presence following her steps, a calculated orchestration of observation, timing, and opportunity. Days passed with mounting fear, and law enforcement felt the weight of every hour. Investigators were determined, but Rifkin's patience had created gaps that delayed discovery. Yet, even the most careful predator leaves traces. Fibers, Slight inconsistencies in routine, fleeting glimpses caught by observant witnesses, they became the clues that turned uncertainty into direction. The breakthrough came slowly, the culmination of persistent, relentless detective work. A single vehicle sighting matched partial license plate information. Investigators cross-referenced it with missing persons reports and observed patterns. Digital forensics revealed subtle connections, phone pings, online activity, movements of vehicles near previous incidents. Each thread of evidence, minor on its own, combined to form an unmistakable map pointing directly to Rifkin. The arrest was executed with precision, a careful orchestration of law enforcement planning. Rifkin's home was approached quietly, officers moving with deliberate caution. Inside, the evidence was horrifying in its banality. Photographs of women, taken surreptitiously, cataloged with dates and annotations, lined shelves and were tucked inside books. Personal belongings of Brooke and others were hidden in drawers, boxes, and containers, meticulously arranged to avoid discovery. Notebooks detailed observations, schedules, and calculated plans, each entry a testament to the patience and intelligence behind his crimes. Forensic teams moved methodically, photographing and cataloging every item. Fibers matched those found on Brooke's clothing. DNA samples confirmed physical contact. Tire tracks and vehicle registrations linked Rifkin directly to the areas where victims had last been seen. Every discovery reinforced the understanding that this was not a crime of impulse. It was the work of a calculating, patient, and highly intelligent predator. Brooke's family learned of the arrest with cautious relief, tempered by the knowledge of the horrifying details that would inevitably emerge. The juxtaposition of relief and horror was intense. The man responsible had been caught, yet the depth of his planning and obsession revealed a scale of cruelty that was nearly impossible to comprehend. Within the courtroom, the story unfolded in devastating detail. Witnesses recounted Brooke's last movements, her routines, her vibrant, ordinary life interrupted by extraordinary evil. Detectives explained the investigation's progression, how minute evidence, painstakingly traced and cross-referenced, led them to Rifkin. Expert testimony illuminated his mind, detailing the patience, calculation, and detachment that allowed him to evade capture and commit crimes over months without detection. The combination of forensic evidence, personal effects, photographs, notebooks, and behavioral analysis left the jury with little doubt. Rifkin's intelligence had been weaponized, his patience applied to deadly effect, and his ability to blend into ordinary life made him all the more dangerous. The verdict, guilty on all counts, was delivered after exhaustive proceedings, bringing a conclusion to the investigation, but not to the lingering impact of his crimes. The community, though relieved that justice had been served, remained forever altered. Campus walks, quiet streets, and familiar trails were never viewed the same way again. The ordinary spaces where Brooke had lived her life became reminders of the invisible danger that had existed among them, a predator whose intelligence and patience had allowed him to strike without warning. Brooke Wilberger's story, her life, and the investigation that followed serve as a chilling reminder of the fragility of ordinary life. The predator's patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning created a perfect storm, but persistent investigation, forensic innovation, and relentless dedication ultimately brought justice. Yet the story lingers, not in headlines or verdicts, but in the quiet reflection that evil can move silently, invisibly, and patiently, waiting for opportunity in places we assume to be safe. Even now, the echoes of Brooke's life and the lessons of her case resonate. The photographs, the notebooks, the carefully cataloged evidence remain haunting reminders that darkness can exist where least expected. They serve as both warning and memorial, a testament to her life, the persistence of investigators, and the terrifying reality that patience and intelligence can be twisted into unthinkable acts. Brooke's story does not end in the courtroom. It continues in memory, in caution, and in the chilling awareness of how ordinary life can hide extraordinary danger. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation when the trial began, each day bringing new revelations that weighed on the minds of the families, the community, and even the jurors. Brooke Wilberger's parents sat with quiet dignity, holding onto fragments of hope while bracing for the devastating details they were about to hear. The prosecution methodically laid out the case, piece by piece, turning months of investigation into a clear narrative of predation, obsession, and meticulous calculation. Witness after witness took the stand. Friends described Brooke's routines, her laughter, her plans, the subtle brilliance in her personality, and the ordinary moments that now felt haunting in retrospect. Professors spoke of her intelligence, her curiosity, her drive to contribute meaningfully to the world. Each testimony painted a portrait of a young woman whose life was vibrant, ordinary, and tragically interrupted by extraordinary evil. Detectives described the painstaking investigation, every detail analyzed, every clue traced. They explained how small inconsistencies in witness statements, a fleeting glance, a partially remembered license plate, or a fiber left behind had become the threads that unraveled Rifkin's elaborate web. Forensic experts detailed tire tracks, DNA matches, hair and fiber analysis, and recovered personal belongings, all evidence of the meticulous planning that defined Rifkin's crimes. The courtroom fell silent as photographs of hidden notebooks, annotated with names, dates, and observations, were presented. These were not just records. They were evidence of a mind obsessed with control, with tracking, with cataloging human life as objects in a cruel experiment. Psychologists and behavioral experts took the stand next, providing chilling insight into Rifkin's mind. They described a predator whose intelligence had been shaped into a tool for manipulation and violence, whose early exposure to neglect and subtle aggression had left gaps in empathy, and whose obsessive attention to detail allowed him to plan crimes with surgical precision. His ability to appear ordinary, even benign, masked a dangerous combination of patience, calculation, and detachment. The experts emphasized his adaptability, the way he learned from each encounter, refined his methods, and executed plans with increasing precision. The audience felt the tension, the creeping horror, as they realized the depth of control Rifkin had exercised over his victims. Family members of Brooke and the other victims offered their testimony, each word a mixture of grief, anger, and the desperate need to be heard. They spoke of the ordinary lives stolen, the trust betrayed, and the emotional devastation that rippled through communities. Their statements humanized the statistics, reminding everyone present that each number represented a life abruptly and violently ended, leaving loved ones to piece together memories and fragments of loss. The defense tried to challenge aspects of the forensic evidence, but the documentation was overwhelming. Rifkin's own records, photographs, and meticulous notes left no room for ambiguity. Witness accounts aligned with physical evidence, and expert analysis confirmed behavioral patterns consistent with a calculated, obsessive predator. Each day of the trial built a clearer picture of the danger he posed and the extraordinary patience he employed in executing his crimes. The verdict was decisive, guilty on all counts. The courtroom, while filled with relief that justice had been served, was also heavy with the lingering weight of horror. For Brooke's family, the conclusion did not erase grief but provided a measure of closure, a confirmation that the man who had stolen her life had been held accountable. For the community, the trial underscored both vulnerability and resilience. They had faced the unthinkable, a predator who had existed among them, patient, intelligent, and unseen. In the aftermath, reflection and analysis continued. Law enforcement officers, psychologists, and criminologists dissected the case, exploring how Rifkin had evaded capture, how he had observed, manipulated, and controlled his victims, and what lessons could prevent similar tragedies in the future. Community members, parents, students, and neighbors remained vigilant, forever changed by the realization that ordinary routines could conceal extraordinary danger. Brooke Wilberger's memory became both a cautionary tale and a memorial. Scholarships were established in her name, community initiatives focused on safety and awareness were launched, and her story continued to resonate in true crime education and public discourse. The photographs, the notebooks, and the forensic evidence preserved the terrifying legacy of a predator's intelligence turned to violence, while also highlighting the perseverance of investigators, the courage of witnesses, and the strength of families seeking justice. Even years later, the case remains haunting. The precision, patience, and intelligence of the predator are reminders that evil often operates quietly, invisibly, and with chilling calculation. Brooke's life, though tragically short, continues to serve as a testament to the fragility of trust, the unpredictability of danger, and the courage of those who refuse to let fear paralyze their pursuit of justice. In the quiet moments, when the campus paths are empty and the streets are still, the echo of her story persists. It is a caution, a memorial and a chilling reflection on the darkness that can exist within the ordinary. Brooke's life ended too soon, but the lessons learned, the justice pursued, and the awareness raised endure, reminding us that vigilance, empathy, and courage are the tools that can illuminate darkness before it strikes again. Even after the courtroom lights dimmed and the verdict was read, the shadow of what had occurred lingered. Brooke Wilberger's story did not end with a guilty verdict, nor did the community's vigilance cease with the arrest of Joel Michael Rifkin. The echoes of her life, and the darkness that had claimed it, continued to reverberate through the streets she once walked, the trails she once hiked, and the classrooms she once filled with laughter and curiosity. There is a disquieting truth that the case reveals. Evil often wears an ordinary face. It does not announce itself with fanfare or noise. It hides in plain sight, patient, intelligent, calculating, waiting for the precise moment when opportunity aligns with intent. Brooke's life, like so many others, intersected with this hidden darkness in a way that seemed impossible to foresee. The realization is sobering. The ordinary routines we take for granted, the quiet walk to a library, the familiar route across campus, the trust we extend to strangers, can become invisible paths to danger. Yet within that darkness, there is also resilience. Investigators refuse to surrender to uncertainty, piecing together fragments of evidence, tracing patterns, and following threads that others might have overlooked. Family members, friends, and community members confronted grief and fear with courage, demanding answers even when the truth was horrifying. Their persistence illuminated the predator's methods, unraveled his meticulous planning, and ensured that justice was ultimately served. Brooke's story also raises questions that may never be fully answered. Could her life have been saved if a single clue had been recognized sooner? How many patterns of predatory behavior go unnoticed, hidden within the rhythms of ordinary life? The answers remain elusive, but the story endures as both warning and memorial. It reminds us that vigilance, awareness, and empathy are not merely virtues. They are protections against the quiet, calculated evil that can exist anywhere, in anyone, and at any time. Her name, her life, and her tragedy continue to resonate, not only in the community she left behind, but in the broader understanding of human vulnerability and resilience. Brooke Wilberger is remembered not just as a victim, but as a symbol, a life of potential, of kindness, of ordinary beauty, interrupted by extraordinary cruelty. And the predator who claimed her life stands as a reminder that intelligence and patience, when divorced from empathy, can become instruments of unspeakable harm. In the end, the darkness that touched Brooke's life may be contained, the predator brought to justice, but the unsettling truth remains. Evil does not always announce itself. It often waits silently, observing, calculating, patient, invisible until the moment it strikes. Brooke's story leaves us with the haunting awareness that safety is never absolute, trust is fragile, and vigilance is essential. And so, the tale of Brooke Wilberger ends not with closure, but with reflection. A life full of promise, a predator's calculated cruelty, and a community forever changed. The horror of what occurred lingers like a shadow, a reminder that beneath the ordinary, the unimaginable can exist, waiting silently in plain sight. Brooke Wilberger's life was stolen, but her story, her memory, and the lessons drawn from her tragedy endure. They echo in every quiet street, every campus trail, every ordinary routine that could conceal extraordinary danger. And in that lingering echo, we are left to confront the chilling reality. The darkness is often closer than we think, patiently waiting, calculating, and observing, hidden behind the face of normalcy.